Welcome. In this conversation, I have the privilege of interviewing Rob Weir. Rob is a distinguished U.S. Army veteran and esteemed alumnus at both West Point and the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. He's the visionary founder of the Maguey Exchange, a groundbreaking supply chain technology platform connecting artisanal spirit producers, starting with agave spirit producers in Mexico with global food and beverage enterprises. Rob's passion for artisanal spirits sparked in 2009 during a backpacking trip through Latin America, immersing him in the rich history and tradition of mezcal. Beyond his adventures, Rob's military service saw him serving as an infantry officer in Afghanistan, collaborating with renowned institutions like the U.S. State Department and USAID to champion national economic development. Post-military, after acquiring his MBA, he ventured into consultancy with Kearney, guiding Fortune 100 entities and international governments on supply chain optimization and economic development. With Maguey Exchange, Rob's vision extends to empower frontier market producers to harness the digital economy, ensuring they reap greater rewards to benefit their communities and legacies. Rob is a wealth of insight. This conversation was energizing, it was inspiring, and I highly recommend you watch the whole thing. So, without further ado, I give you Rob Weir. We're live. Rob, it's good to see you, man.
Good to see you as well. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. I've been looking forward to this one. Right before we hit the red button, we were talking about the enthusiasm we both were sharing. We connected a few weeks ago, and I left thinking, you're like the most interesting guy in the world. You know, you remember those commercials?
No,
Dos Equis.
yeah. Yeah, the Dos Equis commercial. Actually, it's funny because I'm in Mexico right now. But yeah, the interesting man. I mean, I wouldn't say that. I would say I have it's just been a journey, right? And it's been sometimes a meandering journey. Sometimes it's been a very difficult journey. Sometimes it's also been opportunity, things that just kind of align perfectly to one, give you an understanding or a visual of where you are and the fact that you're in the right place, right, at the right time, doing and living in your purpose, right? So I would say it's all of that. Maybe it comes out to a very interesting story, but that's all perspective.
We're gonna get into that story. I know it's gonna be interesting. But before we look at the past, give us a snapshot of the current state. Where are you at these days, physically, but also in a larger sense with your work, your life, your business?
Yeah, absolutely. So right now, in terms of location, I am mostly spending my days in Mexico. And Mexico includes, I say that I named the country just specifically because I'm everywhere in Mexico, right? Mexico City a lot. Also in places like Oaxaca, Mexico, right? Which is, where most of mezcal comes from, in Mexico, as well as other far-flung places that you've probably never heard of, like Chihuahua, Durango, San Luis Potosí, and other various states throughout the country. And then I go back and forth to the US a lot, for business reasons, to, do partnerships and all other fun stuff. So that's location wise where I am, and that's everywhere. Now, where we are in life right now, building the dream, building the business of Maguey Exchange, right? And Maguey Exchange, quite simply, is unlocking the massive $300 billion artisanal spirits and wine market. So what we essentially do are we build digital bridges that connect artisanal brands, importers, and producers. And we're starting with mezcal and tequila. And I can get more into the story later on how that came to be, but it's really just to answer the question and pursue the vision. The question being, what if we can provide full transparency in the artisanal spirit supply chain, ensuring fair trade, economic prosperity, and sustainable practices all at the same time? And the vision where this comes from, starting with, products, starting with producers of mezcal, tequila, agave spirits in general, is imagine a world where, you can take the essence of age-old traditions and cutting edge technology and bring them together to reshape the future of production and consumption. So One, how do we source and find these artisanal products that go back generations, right? Hundreds of years. How do we find and source that, connect these communities and these producers to global markets, and global markets being not in terms of a Coca-Cola or Dos Equis, type of approach where it's just consume, consume, consume. How can we consume responsibly? Responsibly by making sure that the producers are taken care of, making sure that the environment is taken care of, and making sure that you eventually you have an awareness of the work, culture, and tradition behind each spirit that you're imbibing. So that's what the Maguey Exchange is doing. And right now things are going really fast, right? We're connecting with producers all over Mexico. Like, that's part of my work. That's the fun part, right? Going 6 hours out, going over rivers, streams, up mountains, finding these people where they are. And which is more, and what's more fun is understanding them, understanding what their needs are, getting, you know, being involved in their community. Right now it's Muertos, right? It's Dia de los Muertos is a holiday in Mexico where they celebrate, their ancestors, their traditions. It's the Day of the Dead, right? Um, and in my work for the past couple of years, I'm getting invited a lot to these pueblos to be invited or to be involved in their traditions, right? Go to the graveyard with them, celebrate their ancestors, things like that. And that's the most exciting and the most fulfilling part of the work for me. But that's what I'm doing a lot right now, as well as growing the business, fundraising, making sure that technology does all the things that we want it to do, right? More often bringing a viewpoint or perspective or transparency in a very opaque industry. Right. So that kind of summarizes the work that I'm doing right now with Maguey Exchange. And I have a whole team behind me. It's not just me. It's like our CTO, Tabitha Hobert. It's Jermaine Clark. It is a village behind me pushing this along that also, you know, are filled like with people that want to make an impact in the world, because that's what we're all about.
That's awesome. Really tight pitch. I want to respect that, but also I love what you're doing. It's extremely interesting, and I would love to unpack it further to understand where it's going and
Yeah.
the growth trajectory. But before we unpack the current state or do vision casting for the future, big question
Amazing.
for you as an entrepreneur, as a leader, where did it all begin?
So it began, I would say that the beginning was really when I was younger, right? I have a family of entrepreneurs, right? Um, and one group in particular were my great grandparents, right? So a little background about me. I'm a military brat, right? My mother was a colonel in the army. My father was a general in the army, like a brigadier general in the army. And my family has had a history of service in addition to entrepreneurship. And in terms of moving around, like I spent, most of my young life moving every 2 to 3 years, places like Mississippi, places like St. Louis, places like Los Angeles, and then also places like Germany and Japan, etc. Um, that was a way that it like brought a different viewpoint on the world, like that the world is bigger than a town that I grew up in, or like a group of people or a community that I grew up around. And another perspective that brought to me was, that perspective of hard work, that perspective of like growing something that is yours. And I bring up my great grandparents because every summer since when I was a toddler all the way till 15 years old, I spent summers with my great grandparents. And they owned a cattle farm in West Tennessee. So the work that goes into, operating, owning a cattle farm, especially as, an African American in West Tennessee is a lot, right? And, sometimes I often watch them just work day in and day out and struggle to make ends meet, trying to build and grow their business. So in that aspect of growing something that's yours and the hard work that goes behind it and the perseverance you need, I was taught that at a very young age from my grandparents. Now, the beginning of my relationship with agave spirits, specifically mezcal, came from at the tail end of a backpacking trip, a 3-month backpacking trip through South America, Central America, and Mexico. I just had a summer off from West Point. And I wanted to explore the world, right? I wanted to do this backpacking thing, see like different parts, you know, build upon my experiences as a kid moving around to different places, you know? And Oaxaca was my second to last stop from before I like boarded the plane to Mexico City and finished my last year at West Point. But that night, I only spent 2 nights. The first night in Oaxaca was I ran into a mezcalero. I ran into a mezcalero at a bar. And his name is Gregorio. We're still friends, right? He was the one that introduced me to the history, tradition, culture of agave spirits, right? Brought me to his home, introduced me to his family. And as we're sitting around the dinner table, right? And I'm working on my broken Spanish, they're working on their broken English, right? He pulls this like clear jug out from under his sink and is like, "Oh, I've made this. Like, this is what I make. This is mezcal." I'm like, "What's mezcal?" I've heard of tequila at that point. I've heard of Jose Cuervo and all the things that, you like, take shots of at a bar, right? But I had never heard of mezcal. And as he's pouring it and like, explaining to me, I'm sipping it, like it's these two things connected. I'm like, wow, like you made this with your hands. That's amazing. And two, like there is such a passion, there's such a tradition behind each, each sip, each liter that you make, right? And just like my grandparents, this is backbreaking work, right? It takes them, takes mezcaleros like about a month to create one batch of mezcal. And that batch can range from 200 liters to 1,000 liters, but it involves not only cutting down these agave plants that are very spiky, dangerous, in fact, but roasting them on the ground, fermenting them, open air fermentation, and distilling them, all dealing with fire, dangerous stuff, whatever. It's a work of passion, and these people in their communities, they have a very hallowed place in their communities, right? Not only their palenques, their distilleries are places where people gather and, talk, share town gossip and whatnot, right? But it's also, they also are a support system for community as well, right? Um, so he brought me into that world, and that experience stayed with me the rest of my life, right? That experience stayed with me from graduating West Point to becoming an infantry officer, to serving Afghanistan. And my first deployment to Afghanistan was spent 80% doing what an infantry officer does, right? Patrolling the Afghan Pakistani border, host province, right? Doing the thing. And the other 20% was working in concert with organizations like USAID, US State Department, Department of Agriculture to implement these economic development initiatives. And economic development initiatives such as transferring Afghan farmers from farming poppy, which goes into the black market, which goes into heroin, and ultimately funds the Taliban, right? To, farming more sustainable agriculture like corn, wheat, etc. Right. And in this experience, I once again saw the parallels between my grandparents, right? My mezcalero friends, right, in Oaxaca, that, everybody's doing the same thing, right? Everyone's trying to use the fruits of their hard labor, their hard work to make a living, right? And often, as in all cases, they struggle, right? Grandparents struggled. My mezcalero friend, he struggled as well, right? To find buyers. Because, sometimes you're out in the middle of nowhere and it's hard for them to reach you. Second, Afghan farmers, right? Watching, how we often have to build subsidization programs, right? To help them make a living and continue to incentivize them to farm more sustainable agriculture, right? All these things had like very key parallels that eventually led to me coming back to Oaxaca to start Maguey Exchange.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, of course.
You covered a lot of key moments just now. From childhood, seeing you having parents, a father as a brigadier general, a mother as a colonel.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right?
Yep,
And
both in the Army.
In the Army, and seeing your grandparents running a cattle farm in West Tennessee, being exposed to that disciplined lifestyle, hardworking lifestyle early on, and fast forwarding to a point where you were in West Point before your last year, and you decided to build on your childhood travel experiences, your earlier life traveling, take a trip down to Mexico, and you came across a, how do I say it? Mezcali.
A mezcalero.
Mezcalero.
Yep,
And
exactly.
you came across him. You never had tried mezcal. If you've never had mezcal, to contrast that with tequila, it's a different game. It's a different ball game.
It's a whole different ball game, and it largely results from the production process, right? Tequila is very industrialized, commercialized, mostly, right? There's still artisanal tequila production and everything like that, but mezcal is really just like traditional, right? Like some of these things, like after they roast the agave, the pina, for example, they are taking essentially mallets and mashing it by hand, right? Which takes hours. Like I've worked at a palenque before, just so like when I was starting the Maguey Exchange, you know, similar approaches, right? People like us, we have to like get our hands dirty and really like work with it and see it just to understand the process. So I spent 3 days on a palenque, not only harvesting maguey or agave, right, from the fields. So taking a donkey up into the hills, identifying a plant, chopping it down, putting it on the donkey, bringing it down these little trails and stuff like that, to cutting or to roasting the agave, to mashing it by hand, like having blisters on my hands from like mashing it for like 8 hours a day, right? To helping
Jeez.
them ferment and stuff like that, just to understand the process, and also really have a very, you always want to understand what's going on, or I always want to keep in mind what these producers do and how they do it. Because sometimes if you lose sight of that, you don't understand like the way they're approaching it, right? You don't understand their perspective. You don't understand and can't share the stories of like, yeah, like I mashed agave before. This is going to take a while for sure, right? Things like that. So that's one of the things that I try and keep in mind. But like the tequila, mezcal, divide or difference is very large, and that's mostly because of the process and artisanal nature by which it's produced.
And that stuck with you. I mean, I can imagine you getting back on the plane from your trip to Mexico, finding mezcal, finding this gentleman, and kind of opening your eyes to a whole dimension that you didn't even know was there beforehand. And I'm wondering if you could just walk us through a little more of the headspace. You're going back to West Point to go through training and classes, and then eventually get into line units as an infantry officer. But that moment in time was like a thread that stuck with you, that kind of was in some ways parallel or complementary to the thread that began as a childhood, seeing your grandparents work a cattle farm and seeing your parents establish this disciplined lifestyle as Army officers. You know, put us in that headspace for a moment of you flying back to West Point. Was there some gravity or curiosity to kind of get back into that space? Did you think, I want to go back to Mexico and be involved in a greater capacity? Or what were you thinking in those days?
Yeah, so I mean, I've always had a very international like impact focus, right? One of the subjects that I studied at West Point was Arabic. And in fact, West Point sent me to Jordan, for a little bit more than a semester. And they also sent me to Egypt and other places as well to study the language and learn the language, right? Um, and that was a practical standpoint, because I knew I was going to somebody's country, going to Iraq, going to Afghanistan, and to understand the language, and especially like things like the Quran and things like that would help me do my job better, would help me communicate better. And long story short, in Afghanistan, especially, like it definitely helped me a lot. Not only in my interactions with the local communities, but also, being able to understand what's going on, right? Those like intangibles, right? Of how they're taking you and how they're understanding you, and how vice versa. And building that like trust and transparency that, as you need to do your job well and to also be on top of whatever could happen, right? Um, and additionally, one of my areas of study was international relations, right? And I wrote a thesis actually on the federally administered tribal areas of Pakistan. Basically, Pakistan, especially on the border of Afghanistan, is divided into very like cultural, political regions that are not very well controlled by the federal government, right? Or not, they don't have direct control over them. And one of the things that was fascinating to me, especially in international relations, were two things: how like civil wars and how conflicts start, right? For obvious reasons, because a lot of our work in the military was dealing with these situations. But also, how do you build structures and how do you create systems that not only increase the economic prosperity growth of a region, but how do you make those systems more organic to the communities, right? For example, I told you that part of my work in Afghanistan was working with State Department, USAID, et cetera. And I have these these pictures in my mind of being on the combat outpost and some State Department representative or Department of Agriculture representative, you know, arrives on a helicopter. He has a satchel on. He's disheveled. He's just trying to get his bearings or whatever. You bring him inside the TAC and you're like, all right, so because you don't know why they're there. You're like, you're here for something. And, where you ask them, what are you here for? And they're like, oh, we're going to start this program to build infrastructure or do something, right? Something that's been funded by the taxpayer for millions or billions of dollars. And you listen to them run down their plan of how this is actually going to be implemented, and you being on the ground for 5, 6, 7, 9 months, you're like, that's not going to work. I mean, you're going to need more time. They don't know you exactly, things like that. So I watched, a lot of these programs kind of flounder because of lack of understanding of the community. So take that, this international focus of mine, a desire to understand the language, the culture, the people and tradition, and then also my travel experience. And that is kind of what has given me this impact focus that has led to what I'm doing today, right? With the Maguey Exchange. And even when I left the military, right, spent 6 years in the military, I went to business school, University of Chicago Booth School of Business, and then went to consulting just to hone in on these skills, right? Because you can have the passion, you can have the understanding of communities, but business only works a certain way, right? And there are different ways to do it. And in terms of impact as well, impact only works a certain way. So my idea was just combining the business sense, business acumen, and the impact focused direction, putting them together and learning more about it and building something like the Maguey Exchange. So to bring it full circle, I had always, even growing up through travel and all these other experiences that I've just related, wanted to do something to change the world, want to do something to make an impact in these communities. And mezcal in Oaxaca was just one of my first experiences of wow, all right, there's some challenges here, and I want to be able to do something about it, right? So that's kind of where we are today.
That's awesome, man. That is awesome. I mean, you did a great job touching on some of the highlights of your transition out of service. And I imagine each of those highlights are a conversation in and of themselves. Going to business,
Absolutely.
getting out of the Army, going from leading soldiers in combat environments and garrison, facilitating training, the responsibility on your shoulders of leading platoons or beyond, of that's dozens and dozens of soldiers, and then and equipment and planning and all of that goes into that, until a few months later you're back in school with as an individual again, a true individual with responsibilities for your own performance, and that's a transition mentally to go through.
Absolutely. It was it wasn't an easy transition, right? Because you're going from you know being knuckle dragger basically, right? Fighting wars and leading soldiers and speaking a certain way and having a different perspective on the world, right? Very kinetic perspective, to being in a classroom and having one of the best, business school educations in the world, surrounded by people that are not from that experience or have a different lived experience, right? former bankers, private equity people, like tech guys, like things like that, that all have like for the past 5 years, 6 years been working in an office, right? Or doing whatever they're doing, right? And that transition was, very difficult in some ways in the fact that one, you're out of the tribe and you have to learn how to be in a new tribe, right? You have to learn how to be in a new community. And then almost immediately upon entering business school, you have to recruit. You have to figure out what am I going to, I'm going to put food on my table, right? How am I going to live, right? Now, like I don't have a consistent check from Uncle Sam. I have to like do some business stuff, right? For lack of better word, right? So, you have to learn there's a way and a culture around recruiting. There's a way and culture where you fit in the business school and you're just trying to bridge the gap, right? While also like, setting yourself or positioning yourself to take advantage of, why you left the military in the first place, right? So, one of the first things that I did was I did what I knew how to do best, like, right? Be a leader. So I, you know, became my cohort president. I like led a couple of groups, like I was captain of the rugby team. I was uh co-chair of the African American MBA Association. And this was all to like understand like what has worked in the military that works in the business world, and also what doesn't work, right? I can tell you up front that the first couple of months in the military, like I cursed all the time, and people were like, "Oh wow, like he actually just said that," right? Because you're just used to speaking a certain way in the military, right? So like what I did was very deliberate in terms of understanding like how best to move and how best to influence and how best to lead in this new environment. And second, like, I was very focused on how was I going to learn this business stuff, right? And, there's a lot of options in business school. Like you can be a banker, you can do something in tech, you can be a general manager, something like whatever. And I ended up going with consulting because consulting not only scratches those itches of like constant travel and understanding new people, new places, new things, but also like you are iterating on different business problems over and over and again. And often without a lack of understanding or context of, say supply chain, for instance, right? Does this sound familiar? Yes, exactly. It sounds like the military, right? When you're dropped in a region in Afghanistan and your battalion commander is like, figure this out, right? So I saw it having parallels to, my time in the military, and it actually proved it worked out for me, right? Um, my internship was probably one of the most interesting things I've done in terms of just this new way of working. Not only just sitting in a room at a laptop, figuring out some Excel file or trying to understand like how this manufacturing plant works, but also like the rigor and discipline that you need to actually break down a seemingly complex problem into its component parts. And also doing the analysis and research to not only make a recommendation, but, you know, be able to implement that recommendation and tell someone that's been in the business for 20 years, yeah, I know I just learned about this 2 months ago, but like this is how I think you should do it, right? And that's kind of like the essence of consulting, right? Just like understanding the problem really well and understanding how to break it down, and then building a case like a hypothesis driven theory of like, or a hypothesis driven approach, excuse me, of how to address the main pain points of a problem, right? So my internship was, what I can say is like it was with the Department of Defense, and it was about this big thing that like goes in the water and stays under there for a long time, and how to just basically rationalize the supply base of it. So, with this big thing, there's a lot of different parts that come from different places. And what we were trying to figure out is like how to source those different parts in the fastest time to meet a schedule and also at least cost. And it involves going to manufacturing plants all over the country, understanding how they're doing it, breaking it down and putting it into a model, right? I had
Wow.
never done something like that before, right? And, it creates to be able to solve this type of problem, you have to have like a intense focus and passion about it. You have to actually care, right? And you also have to be like focused on the answer or the solution. And I think, this rigor that consulting, requires in its consulting teams, right? Really prepared me for what was next and to get this full-time offer from the consulting firm, do more problems all over the world, and then also apply them later to that same rigor to Maguey Exchange, right? So
That's
to
awesome.
bring that full circle is just, you know, I left the military and did these experiences like business school and consulting just to be able to get the skill set and the acumen to be able to make an impact in the world. And I'd say it's helped me quite a bit for sure.
Thank you for sharing that, Rob.
No problem.
There's the rigor and the consulting world is really interesting, and the skill set you developed it and going into business school is also interesting. I think there's something that you touched on a little bit, and I mean, it seems like to me a theme that's a common throughout all of these experiences is adaptability,
Mhm.
and among other things. But what strikes me, Rob, is you're an outlier. If we put 100 other Afghan vets in a room, you would be among the top 10 or 1% of high performers in the private sector. That's my view. I think it's safe to say you're performing at a very high level, in business and in career outside of that. And if you look at the larger population of vets that get out, they a lot of them encounter the challenges of transition, and they go a different direction. Then instead of leaning into the the new environment, the new culture, the new opportunities to adapt, it kind of gets them in this stuck loop of being fixated in the previous space and failing to apply the disciplines, the core competencies of adapting and overcoming.
Mhm.
You talked about a battalion commander drops you into an area of operations and says, "Figure this out." Yeah, it's like taking that perspective into the college environment, the business environment. You made that jump, that intellectual leap, going from, okay, you're not wearing camis anymore. You're not in a military unit. You're a solo, you're a solo dude operating on a campus, but you've leveraged that perspective. And I think if you could unpack that a little further on the way that you were thinking about it, the way that you do think about it, taking that infantryman, leader's perspective to adapt regardless of the team size, the organizational culture, the environment, be it academia, big corporation like consulting, or startup life. You've been able to transcend different categories, but have a common theme that's built upon itself. I think that's accessible to vets, to people in any career field at any stage, and especially in this day and age where volatility is at an all-time high. There's so much complexity. Things are changing every month. Adaptability and the resilience to stay adapting every day, every year, is
Right.
key. So I think you have a demonstrated level of success over your career and achieving at a high level, adapting. So I wonder if you could just get into that a bit more.
Yeah, I think it's part structural and part like personality, right? I would say the structural part is throughout my life, from West Point to Afghanistan to business school to consulting, and even also in the military, like training, like ranger school and stuff like that. I'm so used to being put in these situations where you don't know what is going on and you have to figure it out that like, I'm used to these crucibles and I've been in these like some of the like the best crucibles in the world, right? That forces you to grow or fail, right? And you have no choice one or other. So you have to keep pushing forward, right? So I think structural, I've been in these experiences and I've been, fortunate to like be successful in those experiences to constantly go to the next level or at least open up a new ability, perspective, or understanding, right? Because it's not just about the things you can do. It's how you think, right? How do you not only look at problems, but how do you take all this disparate information, create a narrative, and then make a decision, right? So I think structurally, my life, I've been very fortunate to be put in these, or unfortunate, depending on, how you view it, like definitely very hard times, but putting myself in those situations to grow, adapt, and overcome. And then also having the perspective that life is all about growing, adapting, and overcoming, right? There's always a next challenge. There's always something else that you want to do, and you continue to push yourself. In terms of like personal, it's more, I think there's a little bit of risk appetite in there. I have very high appetite for risk. I also have the confidence of an infantryman. Like, I don't know anything about this, but it'll buff out, right? Like that, that like, that view or that confidence that you'll hear, I'm not comparing myself to Elon Musk or Elon. You hear super successful businessmen and entrepreneurs. They're like, they have the confidence and the belief that what they're doing is going to work, right? You can't tell them anything, right? Same thing. If you ask me about Maguey Exchange, like, do you think this is going to work? Absolutely. I think it's going to work. Why? Because I decided to do it. Right. So it's like that confidence and like a risk taking and that, you know, understanding that you don't know everything. Right. But, when presented with the right information or with even being presented with minimal information, you have to have confidence to make a decision and you have to make that decision. Right. Similar to, our training in the military, right? Make a decision. LT, right? It's like, where are we going, left or right? Um, so I think, partially is a structure that's like pushed me to develop these skills and capabilities and also develop the grit to like really go through some hard times and push forward until the end. And partially personal in terms of, whatever you do, whatever you decide to do, why do it halfway, right? Um, you're already devoting your time, your mental energy, your passion at the opportunity cost of doing other things in life, right? Why not, do that 100%? Why not give everything you have into it? And also be okay, if it doesn't work out, at least you tried, right? There's a couple sayings about that, right? Like Man in the Arena by Teddy Roosevelt, right? Um, that's just kind of a perspective that I have and how I've built that. And also just kind of seeking different things to do, different challenges. Like I'll tell you like flippantly, like I get bored very easily, right? So like I can't sit, I'm a type of person, I can't sit around and like twiddle my thumbs and just kind of coast. Like I'm always just looking for something else to do or looking or being very curious about the world, exploring different things from foreign countries to like different types of food, things like that. Right. So that's like, the personality that uh, the characteristics about me that I think helps me and leverages these crucible like experiences to constantly grow.
Mm. Thank you for sharing that, Rob.
Yeah. Hope I answered your question, by the way. So
You did. It's an awesome answer. You've covered a lot of where you've come from and brought us close to where we started, which is where you're at now. I'm sure
Yeah.
there are details we probably should have covered in more or could cover in follow-on discussions on your history, but give us some insight on what's next for you for the business. What happens after this?
Yeah, for what's next for the business, right? Like, you build out this vision, build out this plan of connecting artisanal producers all over the world to the digital economy, right? And you have to follow up on that plan, right? You have to do what you say you're going to do, right? And that is very, there's a path to that, right? And one of the biggest parts of that path is building the team to do that, right? So I've been working on building the team, expanding the team to be able to accomplish this. Not only that, there's also like a preparation in terms of, the minutia, building a supply chain from say, random place on a hill on a mountain in Mexico all the way to New York, for example, right? There's a process to that. And as the CEO, as a leader of the company, it's always not only understanding what needs to be done right now, but where are we going, right? Which is similar to, being a platoon leader in the army, right? You always have to have that thought, have that strategic thought to understand what's next and what's the risks associated with certain courses of actions, right? But specifically right now, it's building the team, right? It's building also the partnerships. What we're doing, in fact, with Maguey Exchange is building an ecosystem of producers, importers, logistics companies, things like that, technologists that are all part of doing this together. Because the main problem that we're attacking is transparency, right? And to address that transparency in the industry that often puts producers at a disadvantage, that often puts buyers at a disadvantage in terms of time, cost, effort, etc. And producers from like not understanding or not having a visibility on, you know, different prices and things like that to make better decisions. What we're attacking is transparency. And we're using technology to build an ecosystem that enables that communication, enables that visibility, enables that collaboration. Because right now, everything is in a silo, right? And everybody's feeling the same pain, but there's no like solution that takes into account all these things, right? And I think that transparency not only applies to agave spirits, not only applies to artisanal spirits, but also producers everywhere, right? Like if you were looking at macro trends, our world stands at an interesting crossroad. Like you have supply chain disruptions that people experienced during the pandemic, right? Where things took longer to get to you, they cost a lot, or they never got to you at all, right? And this is like an urgent need for innovation across all industries. Where do we get our stuff from? How do we get it? And how do we get it in the most optimized way, right? That isn't painful, isn't super costly, isn't too much effort and stuff like that. And a lot of this too, like rests on the ability to create a system that everyone can communicate, that everyone can see and know for a fact different information about their products. And oh, by the way we consume, right, and the way we produce is not sustainable for the planet, right? Eventually, we're going to run out of things, and that is because there's a lack of connection between the end consumer and the earth, the environment. That you're pulling this from, right? You ask the producers and farmers that work closely with the earth. They're like, yeah, I mean, it's cool that, mezcal is growing. It's cool that tequila is growing, right? And everybody wants it, but we're running out of agave plants. I don't know how to find the rest of them, right? We're also planting agave plants at an increasing rate, which has an effect on the environment, has an effect on the water supply, has an effect on these communities that, that live very close, like live a very agrarian type lifestyle, right? So a lot of their patterns of life are changing because of this. So you have this situation where we're pulling a lot from the ground and there's no visibility or control or transparency on how we're doing it and how we're producing it, which limits our ability to do it sustainably. And also creates this disconnect with the end consumer who's just like, I just want some good tequila. But if they knew what was going on, or if they had an ability to source sustainably, to have an ethical exchange between producer and themselves, we'd be in a whole different type of situation, right? But what we're doing is using technology, advanced technology like blockchain to build these digital bridges just for table stakes so everyone can understand what's going on. And then we can have an effect on the cost it takes for buyers, the source, the pricing and revenue that producers are getting for their hard work. Like I said, it takes a month to produce a single batch of mezcal. That's what we're trying to affect in the system for the benefit of all.
Rob, you are a wealth of insight and inspiration.
Thank you. Appreciate
What
it.
haven't we covered that we should before we break off the line this afternoon?
Hey, I think we covered most things. I mean, we can have a whole other conversation about the consulting experience, the
That'd be awesome.
the inception of the Maguey Exchange. Like, actually, how did I go out and start building this?
Yes.
How did I find hundreds of suppliers? How did I, get to understand the problem really well? We can talk about,
Absolutely.
deeper into what the Maguey Exchange does in terms of the product. But, I think the vision of the Maguey Exchange, and this is like my North Star, is, what if we could, connect artisanal producers everywhere to the digital economy, right? What if we can, reach out, talk to producers in Kenya, in Cambodia, in Chile, in Peru, etc., and be able to build a structure that enables them to earn a living above a subsistence style, right? Trying to struggle to make ends meet, just like my grandparents, right? Just like my, mescalero friends, just like Afghan farmers. Like, what if we can build a system that is inclusive and brings all these people into the prosperity, economic prosperity that, you know, people in France or, winemakers in France are experiencing or something like that, right? I think that's something that we can do that would be truly beautiful and is also very timely, right? Demographically, right? The Western world population is declining, right? Places like Africa, places like South America are growing rapidly, right? We have to figure out a way to include these people, right? We have to also figure out a way to do this deliberately by building a system that is equitable and ethical, right? Otherwise, we're just going to have a bunch of people mad at each other again for no reason, right? And people feeling left out. So that's the North Star that I'm working on. And yes, it starts with mezcal, it starts with tequila, it starts with artisanal spirits, but you know, this stuff are what we're doing can be applied everywhere. It's a sector geographically agnostic. And that's what we're striving for at Maguey Exchange.
That's awesome. You are a servant leader, a man of strong character, an impact-driven entrepreneur. And I think the statement I opened with about the most interesting man in the world still stands true. After hearing you share parts of your origin story for the last some 40 minutes or so, I'll say that there's so much more left that I think you could share. And what I hope is another discussion, getting into your experience in the consulting world, learning more about how you learned to apply the rigor and the discipline of decomposing problems into their component parts, conducting the research and developing recommendations and business cases, and then following through with the implementation on that. I think that in and of itself, that methodology is something that oftentimes fails to connect to a lot of entrepreneurs and business owners who haven't been exposed to that school of thought. Also, the catalyst for your current venture and how you began to understand the problems, that's a whole realm to unpack in and of itself. But I think we're planting the flag there for us to potentially pick back up in the
Absolutely.
next conversation.
To be continued for sure. Right.
Be continued.
There's a lot to dig at this and, thanks for asking the questions that you did. Definitely allowed me to take a step down memory lane. And that's super important in terms of understanding and appreciating where anybody's journey starts and the origin of that, what series of decisions led them to what they're doing now. And it also provides a foundation and groundwork for understanding, where we're going in the future. And, happy to share this more. And, really,
Um,
once again, thanks for inviting me on this podcast. It's been really
you
fun.
got it, Rob. I agree. We'll do it again real soon.
Excellent. We'll
Thanks,
love
Rob.
nothing more. Thank you.